Chapter 3. The Arrival. My face hugged against the toasty surface for quite some time, potentially even hours, while I snoozed atop the sand-riddled carpet, my back and neck sweltering under the blazing red spotlight in the sky. In the back of my mind, I knew my skin would soon turn leathery and charred if I didn't move fast. As I raised my head, a pounding horde of blood zipped up my skull, detonating a fat helping of headache. To make matters worse, my vision became blurred while I rose to my feet near delirious, starved and dehydrated while a desperate mouth sat dry to the bone, left panting for any drop of fresh water I could find. Fueled by a basic biological need, my eyes darted up and down my brand new home, investigating the next hurdle in my sprint toward survival. Before me was a desolate island, a soulless paradise, a rare opportunity to venture into depths devoid of any distractions, technology, or human interaction, solely coupled with my mind to keep me company. A dangerous recipe for a guy like me. As I walked forward, the searing sand chipped away at my soles, which were pruned and delicate to the touch. My graceful stroll divulged into a limp, a methodical saunter that led to an entrance. Nestled together below the shade of lumber towers was a thick slab of brush. Etched seamlessly and unwavering they clung, forming a partition only found surrounding the barriers of a maze, designed to prevent anyone from entering or leaving. A thought that concerned me. My foreboding was silenced by a loud churning in my stomach, sounds that were likely elicited by the clamoring of coconuts that clunked together 40 feet above me, teasing a near cripple while they succulently simmered in the sun. Delicious juice I knew my tongue would never taste. A realization that took hold after I spent several minutes scampering around the area looking for any of their fallen comrades. To my dismay, the ground was barren, vacant of anything edible, and instead stockpiled with almost invisible thorns that pricked against my toes, minuscule horned spheres that dug into my skin with every step. Overrun with agitation, I ventured through the forest's shield. The barricade was fiercely thick. Each rip and pull through the sea of branches caused more to come flying forward, having to duck and dive through prickled arms of briar, even having to crawl on my shins and forearms for a time, feathering myself with the chocolate slime, trudging through the trenches, sinking into a crib of mealworms. With care, over time, I was able to navigate through the obstruction's labyrinth, picking up on its wicked pattern of sudden slits and slots. As I funneled through the barricade's last dreary hole, my eyes were gifted by a wondrous sight. It was as if I was Dorothy taking my first steps into Oz, leaving a drab, dreary home painted in bleak strokes of black and white, and being catapulted into a wonderland of color. Flowers sprung from every hole in the ground, dazzling and vibrant while they fluttered towards the stray beams of light, fortunate enough to reach the earth. Their efforts thwarted by a massive umbrella of laced leaves that cascaded a welcoming coat of shade from above, one that eased the simmer of scorch the island possessed and created a chilled mist that tickled against the blades of grass from below. Blades that nestled within the spaces between my toes and cultivated into a verdant field that stretched for miles on end. Swirls of shrubbery surrounded me, many bedecked with plum blossoms encrusted with canary thorns. Droves of awe-inspiring fungi polluted the ground with their fumes, my favorite being the raging red mushrooms decorated in ivory blotches, each set plugged into the floor, mirroring the sight of a plump ladybug. My least favorite being the periwinkle toadstools, each peppered with blackened bulbs brimming with pus. They seemed like soulless eyes that watched my every move, fiends that came equipped with ticking time bombs. From time to time, one of their bulbs would burst into the air, popping like zits on a teenager, spreading its venomous bile at a 3-foot radius with every calculated eruption. And last, but certainly not least, I couldn't possibly forget the swarms of spider silk that draped down hundreds of feet from the branches above. Almost invisibly thin, but housing droves of hopeless butterflies that flapped their wings in desperation. insects that seemed abnormally large, the size of birds, and painted with unusual patterns. In fact, I could have sworn one of them possessed wings that seemed to have an uncanny resemblance to the American flag, star-spangled and patriotic while it wrangled away in its tomb. Over time, my eyes became spoiled by the engrossing stimuli that etched the island's lair. Hyper-aware of landscapes and organisms I had been deprived of, I felt like a child again, experiencing and discovering with an untainted lens. A rare sensation lost in the journey to adulthood, allowing oneself to bask in bewilderment. In truth, I could go on and on about the rainbow-clad slice of bliss in which I was transported to. Despite the bounty of visual desserts, what occupied my attention most is what the island lacked. The first being sound. Beyond the gentle breezes that puffed through the air, not a note could be heard. No birds chirping, frogs ribbiting, or waves crashing from afar. I was left with nothing, the exception being a minute humming that sang in the air, an obscure choir of frequencies that vibrated in my cochlea, nudging against it until my ears popped and wailed. Moving past the fairyland's monotone soundtrack, it was honestly startling to see scenery so rich in life, and yet so starved of a key element: animals. Think about it. When talking about a rainforest, images of tigers, orangutans, toucans, snakes, and other reptiles often spring to the forefront. While gazing across the acres of wildlife, not an animal could be seen. As if the island needed another ingredient to add to its eerie tone, the fact that I was the only living, breathing thing that contained a pulse was jarring. Assuring in some respects, however, it begged the question, where did all the animals go? And who took them? It was vital I found answers. However, pondering these questions in my head only added to my exhaustion. In fact, as I ventured deeper into the forest, frequent stops to rest became a necessity. Never has my body driven on such depleted fumes. Each stop afforded me the opportunity to scope the land in which I may live on for the foreseeable future. Its persistent pattern of perplexity was unwavering. Plants almost indescribable, and trees that shifted from pale greens to shimmering silvers, each held in place with stocky indigo trunks, at the bases of which were the first set of friends I met on the island. Draped upon the earth were almost half a dozen spotted dart frogs, all frozen and lifeless, only blinking from time to time to signal that their souls weren't ripped from their spines. Each frog decorated in different patterns, one etched in cheetah print, another leathery and gray, containing an almost trunk-like nose, and a third possessing a fur-like quality that mirrored a Dalmatian's. It was as if Cruella de Vil designed a fresh sweater for each of the little amphibians. The rest of the little tykes were painted in luminescent sheens, patrolling the lifeless grounds like vibrant city signs and traffic cones. Afraid of their venomous kiss, I scuffled off as quickly as possible. To my dismay, my trail was followed by every one of them. All 7 of the deadly dwarves hopped and plopped along from leaf to leaf, gazing with wonderment at the bumbling fool trying to survive. Their efforts were calculated as they kept a safe distance, never threatening, but ever so often one would get close. Not a difficult issue, as every time I whipped my head back at them, they would creep backwards, almost guiltily. Never a good sign when even mindless frog is able to pick up on the alarm in your eyes. Part of me was content knowing I wasn't alone on the island, and yet also a much louder part of me wasn't so fond of their presence. How can one ignore poisonous assassins that wait for you around every corner? It's easy. You don't. Slogging through the jungle became more than tiresome, the land almost looping itself in presentation, creating the illusion that I was hopped up on shrooms and gliding along a treadmill. If only that was true, as that sounds like an exceptionally better time than what I was having. As the journey continued to waver, my mind followed suit. A brain without water is no brain at all. I slithered along, carefully traveling through the booby-trapped ground. Spiked rocks, piercing thorn bushes, and razor blade-like sticks lied at my feet after every step. Those hurdles, coupled with dehydration, likely provided pure comedy to an outside observer, as I must have looked like a plastered idiot doing his best to play hopscotch. Every so often I would lose my wits and frolic straight into the grasp of one of my many spiderwebs surrounding me. Each grievous incident was an embarrassing affair, although over time I gained comfort being hugged by the silky balls of cotton, ignoring the likely pug-sized arachnids who called those webs home. Alas, following hours of adventure, I made it to the brunt entrance of the rainforest. A dangerous puzzle riddled with tricks and alluring eye candies stacked atop every emerald shelf available. My conquest also did not come without reward. The giant pot of gold that awaited me was the introduction of a second sound, a chattering that shattered through the island's prolonged block of humming. It darted into my skull as the splattering of song encapsulated the air. In truth, I wasn't ready for such a glorious shift. My body didn't know how to react and froze into a dulled state of transfixion, marinating in the melody that echoed inside my eardrums. A much-needed vacation away from the monotonous buzzing that rocketed me into pure ecstasy. Ideas popped and fizzled in my brain as the sound was familiar, and yet in my mental state this game of identification became damn near impossible. And then, with the snapping firing of a neuron, it clicked. I knew the sorcerer who had cast me within its trance. Immediately I changed course and teetered towards environments unknown, delusions of grandeur fueling my soul as the once ambiguous voice continued to call. Knowing my luck, it could have easily been a swarm of wasps or my mind playing tricks. And ideation I never even considered. Nowhere in my Gulliver did I have space for petty pessimism. My realization was clear, and by some miracle, I was correct. After pushing my way through the last level of thickets and groves, finally, there in front of me was a crystal clear pool of water. Above it was a waterfall that thundered overhead, hundreds of feet high, surrounded by a plethora of sharp and weathered boulders. I only gazed upon the presence for a few milliseconds before my mind slipped back into a daze of thirst. My sun-sapped lips smacking in delight while I sprinted towards the water and fell to my knees. Instantly I slurped the crisp and beautiful godsend. Gallons of happiness plunged down my throat, effectively filling my once empty stomach. I may have been drinking water from the barrels of a pond, but from how my brain reacted, it felt like I was consuming liquefied rapture. A mere glass of comfort from the pool of nirvana. It likely only tasted similar to tap water infused with chemicals and pesticides, but during those desperate gulps for life, I couldn't give a shit. It was delicious. While my body and mind recharged, I was left to my own devices near the edge of the blue, analyzing the unique landscape before me. From my knowledge, water often means life and vegetation, not an abandoned sanctuary. The earth that surrounded my soul was barren, no animals frolicking about, and an empty silence surrounding the plunging liquid from above. The waterfall loomed overhead, an enormous sink set to full blast. Spurts of ocean plummeted from the mouth of its cataract in a violent fashion. As a whole, the general appearance was reminiscent of a crater sliced in half, surrounded by a border of pine trees. The peak contained a skyscraper-like presence due to its visibility, or lack thereof. While the mountain contained a gradual incline, the falls were steep, the highlight being the roller coaster-like drop. While the base of the falls contained vociferous and harsh rapids, the water petered out into a calm sphere of motionlessness. Even as the rapids raged overhead, the bath remained still, as if I was looking at a picture frame. White foam glossed the edges of the pool, perfecting the celestial portrait. The mountain, on the other hand, wasn't such a pleasant sight. Oddly shaped and dilapidated, casting a gloomy shadow over the pool. A pewter-decorated Goliath with sporadic streaks of black and brown scattered across. It was a refreshing break away from the infallible haven I aimlessly walked through, almost jarring like a pale canvas struck and splattered with elephant dung. Intrigued by the enormous anomaly, I waddled my way toward the jagged gray giant. In the back of my mind, thinking there must have been a stroke of beauty I was blatantly missing. I was wrong. In reality, the mountain was doing its best to hide a grievous secret. The closer I crept to them, the more I noticed what lied at the base of the falls. A sea of bones. Bones unlike any I have ever witnessed. Aberrant structures and molds made the figures unrecognizable. No skeleton left intact, as they must have been altered with, or eaten. They sat there scattered around on decrepit, and left me with an avalanche of questions. Whose bones were they? Why the fuck are there so many of them? Unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to meander about and question the unknown. Daylight was fading, and famine was growing. I found it laughable that hunger was becoming a useless repellent for catastrophic thoughts. The sight of rotten cartilage alone would handicap even the strongest of minds. While my tendency to dwell in dangers was ever present, it wasn't as tantalizing as a piping hot meal. My next journey began as I trekked around the crater, looking for any sources of food, and came across an interesting pattern. The surrounding trees were stripped of coconuts or dates, and the bushes left much to be desired. All around me was plucked and empty, nothing consumable in sight. The crater contained a shield similar to the one that protected the outer rim of the shore. While not as stout, still well constructed and firm. Within the evergreen wall was a vast multifarious of plants. Starry indigo blossoms, scarlet-encrusted petals that stuck out like puckered lips, and a bulbous pink flower that contained thorns the size of daggers protruding out from its stem. Floral patterns like something out of Alice in Wonderland added to the bizarre excuse of an island. I spent my last hours of daylight on a quest for anything to ease my stomach. I wasn't picky either. Berries, nuts, or seeds were all welcome commodities, but not a single goddamn thing was there. Constantly having to slither in and out of the shield to explore, but never traveling too far, as I was afraid that I'd get lost in the jungle's maze. It was an immensely frustrating world in which I was transported to. A noxious puzzle that was just begging for me to take a wrong turn, to get lost in its trickery and to add to its heaping pile of bones. In my eyes, that fate was becoming more likely the further I strayed from the island's sole offering of beverage. When your life's on the line, smacking a gift horse in the mouth is an easy way to end it. And so I returned to my haven. And after retreating to the pool of a defeated man, I started to realize why this depleted wasteland wasn't such a happening vacation spot. As the sky darkened into dusk, I gathered palm fronds and branches to create a makeshift bed for the evening. My quest for food was futile, and in truth, I should have stopped when the pattern became obvious. While warmth would have been a splendid ally during the war with night, there was no need in attempting to make a fire. I didn't have the materials or energy to even produce a spark. Consequently, my new bed was a clusterfuck of leaves with vines used as knots to help keep it together. I placed it on top of the plush grass that circled the water and attempted to rest. Believe it or not, but it's awfully difficult to fall asleep when food deprivation is rattling in your mind. Not even the atmosphere's marvelous theater could soothe me while I lied there exhausted, just staring at the moon. It seemed abnormally large, giving off a bright, magnified glow. Pretty, but when you're trying to sleep, it's a tad annoying when a 2,000-foot wide nightlight jams itself into your face. As the hours passed by, my mind would drift towards the stars dancing in the sky, soaring and blazing across space like sparklers on a hot summer's night. A display far different from my home in New York. Smoke-fueled smog blocked any resemblance of a star, our only exception being the bright, blinking planes hovering above. While my time back home progressed, I discovered something obvious and overlooked about the city. It's overrated. I, like many others in the past, fell victim to the dazzling architecture and rich history the city held. Attributes that may still exist to this day, but are qualities that can be seldom taken advantage of. Wealth is a requirement to live in a location that isn't infected by crime and pollution. History, while a nice perk, is wasted on the old and the ignorant. History doesn't help me pay for my bills and make my apartment bigger. It does the opposite. I'm sure others would disagree, but I don't mean to project my inner thoughts onto every red-blooded American that walks those black and gloomy streets every day. Personally, I hate the city because it rips the comfort and opportunity for solitude out from my life and replaces it with toxic people and heaping piles of stress. I seem to be an outlier on that front, though, so take my opinion with a giant grain of salt. Some people enjoy living as a rat in a cage. Some people don't. My internal disgust for the city always bred a desire to quit work and find a new home, somewhere quiet and exotic. Plucked from the clogged sewers and catapulted into a third world, country on the fringes of society. Places devoid of people for miles on end and blessed with a surplus of natural beauty. To the credit of my employer, sucking valuable years from my youth has positives. My job provides me with a spoiled array of travel destinations I get to pick and choose from every month. Ontario, Hawaii, Australia. If the place exists on a map and contains a popular airport, I've probably been there. While many of my coworkers consider those trips as opportunities to make their pockets a few inches deeper, for me they were avenues to indulge myself in the wonders of detaching from the modern world. Every night I would leave my technology and belongings in the hotel and wander out into the unknown, hiking up mountains, trekking deep into forests, walking the shorelines of beaches. All those adventures gave me a feeling nothing else could. Isolation is a beautiful thing to partake in. It grants someone the ability to escape into the wild and twisted imagination of the human mind. The truth is, every time I went out on one of my adventures, deep down, I always hope I get lost. My therapist used to love pointing out that fact to me. Proof of my flaws, proof of my instability. I recognize why that might trouble people to hear, but I've been tested, and I'm far from depressed. In reality, those nights were some of the best I've ever had in my life, and the rush of joy I felt became addicting. It's hard to explain, but a feeling that seemed to spawn out from the black sky. Something I never understood, but for some reason, I always had an affinity for the dark and all the remarkable things that come with it. My peculiar delight dates back to when I was a child, around 7 or 8, and always used to sneak out into my backyard to catch fireflies. I'd bring down an empty canister and wait long after dusk for the creations to come out and play. It was innocent, in a time where life wasn't reality and where imaginary friends weren't threats to my sanity. I would often include them in my games, these creatures, and once our jar was full, I would climb up my dad's ancient and weathered ladder until I reached the white gutters that covered the edges of the roof. Slowly, I would creep over the sun-bleached rafters and reach the highest point on my chimney. Once I was firmly planted on the most treacherous point imaginable, I would crack open my jar and release all of my new friends. I always expected them to fly upward into heaven, free from the shackles of the earth, away from the cold and dreary ground where I live. Oh, how I wish I could go back to those times, protected in a warm bubble of blissful ignorance, safe from the violent stab of reality that waited for me as every day passed by. At one point in my life, I even tried to slip back into my ignorance. Turned out to be a silly strategy, but it wasn't without reason. Think about it. As we grow gray and weathered, so too does our propensity for joy. Sure, stress is a byproduct of added responsibility, but I also believe stress is a choice. Fuel to drive us away from failure by amplifying the stakes of every word, action, and decision we choose. I felt like if somebody's goal is true happiness, then they needed to adopt an entirely different mindset, the same one we're born equipped with. Children live in bliss because they don't dwell in imperfection. Whatever sadness that comes with a toddler's tantrum can erase with the lick of a little lollipop, a silly knock-knock joke, or a hug from a parent. Can you imagine that? That life could be that simple. From where I stood, I wasn't so sure that those quick fixes were beyond my reach, that I lost my gift of reconciliation. I think over the years I was just taught not to use it. Adults taste it with drugs and alcohol, but those illusions are forever fleeting, colossal anchors that come tethered to side effects. It's impossible to fly when those weights are dragging you down. Maybe Peter Pan had it right. Maybe we aren't meant to grow up. Or maybe we confuse growing up with growing scared of a world that was meant to be celebrated. This was the mindset that set me up for failure. It rendered me naive, and I ended up getting hurt. The sad thing is, I knew it would too. I knew one day I'd find those thoughts to be foolish, that I'd regret ever thinking those words, that by putting on a blinders, life couldn't be more clear. I once thought happiness was a gift waiting in my hands, and that logic was the enemy that let it slip through my fingers. I was an idiot. Logic is the only thing that can protect someone from pain. Once the world is painted in strokes of black and white, no one can surprise you. They can never let you down if you expect nothing from them. It was a lesson I had to reteach myself over time, and I had learned it before. at 12. Truthfully, growing up was far from perfect. My parents hated each other, and I was constantly alone. Too dumb to realize how human my parents were, that they could make mistakes, and that people designed to protect me could inflict the greatest damage of all, because my expectations were too high. My mother was kind. Too kind. She ignored my father's shortcomings and was always content clinging to the bleak, empty hope of change. She had me at a young age and spent her 20s caring for me. Extraordinary, in my eyes, as I'm almost out of my 20s now and I can hardly care for myself. She and I were always together, never apart. A mother who became attached while I grew resentful. Smothered by her overprotective grasp, I would hide from her and avoid her until she finally left me alone. Something I loved, but something we did not share. I ripped away her only vice for happiness as I matured. I realized that. I try not to dwell on it, though, but sometimes it slips into my mind, and it gets no easier. I used to have a father, too, although he's lucky to have ever heard the word dad leave my mouth. He was always working treacherous hours, slaving away at a local pharmacy. He would often get home around 11, slip into my door and whisper, "I love you, Walt. Good night, buddy." As time went by, he forgot to say I love you. Eventually, he never came in at all. Honestly, I don't remember much about my father, the only exception being my 12th birthday. For the first time in my life, he took off from work and spent the entire day with me. He made me a gigantic breakfast, took me to my first ball game, and spent the entire night talking about how proud he was to be my father. And while that may come across as cheesy or idealistic, there's a reason behind it. It was by design. The next day, my parents woke me up early in the morning and my heart sank as their faces were pale in heartache. Look, I'll save you the gritty details and PTSD-inducing dialogue by cutting to the chase. My parents split up. No big deal. Half of marriages end in divorce, yada yada yada. It's no reason to despise or despair. That is until my father peeled off his mask to reveal the true man he was. A coward. Later that night, a soft knock hit my door, and my father peered his head in. "Walt, I love you, buddy," he said as his voice wavered in anguish. I did not look his way or say anything to him. I was still numb in shock and waited until my door shut closed and the sound of my father's car could be heard driving away. To his credit, he waited for quite some time before he closed my door, waiting for closure that was never given. He thought I was old enough. He was wrong. He thought I would be better off living with my mom. He was 100% right. For that reason, I did not hate him. I did not shed a tear. Hate is something that drains you further and further into oblivion. It's also a stance, a unilateral decision to still cling to what you detest, because deep down you know you still have the capacity to admire. That's where the frustration is birthed, where cognitive dissonance reigns supreme. How can I still care so much about something I'm supposed to hate? We devote a level of emotion so high that our bodies run red when they're in our sight, and our stomachs churn when their names are even mentioned. Hate and love walk a similar path. Hardly as black and white as many people think. Those same butterflies that flutter in the presence of your beloved will transform into vultures that eat away at the dying remains of relationship, picking at it limb from limb, but preserving life in the off chance they change. I did not give my father hate, for my hate was too much to give. Instead, I let the relationship die, avoiding the black cloud that follows many a people, a shadow that's cast upon them everywhere they go, ever lingering while it rains above. Looking back, I still believe I made the right choice. However, I fear the cloud may have skipped the top of my head and instead swelled inside my mind, creating damage that's impossible to destroy. No umbrellas protect me from the downpour. You may be wondering why I'm blabbering on about something so commonplace. No father deserves a son detachment for an act so small. The reality is, after that one fateful night, I never saw him again. No letter, no calls, no cards. He was gone. Vanished, like he never even existed. It is a memory that's seared into the vessels of my brain forever. It was a memory I let slip into my mind as I lied sprawled out in the grass. Annoyed, I shook my head and slapped at my skull until the memory faded away. Eventually, the thought was replaced by a burning need for food. A terrible thought to dwell on, but something that was better than the former. Over time, I mapped out a plan for finding my first meal. The next day, I would continue my productive trek into the forest and find an enormous McDonald's planted dead center. It sounded like a good plan. Nothing is better for a malnourished body than impeccably microwaved and processed meat. It's funny, when I was starving out there, I always craved crap junk food I never ate. Burgers, fries, ice cream, cake, candy, and other injurious products, ready to clog my arteries and make me a certified diabetic. Fried fat sacks raced in my head, flashing damaging images of hope into my brain. As time went on, my eyes wavered. My mind emptied into blissful nothingness. That was no easy task, though. I deserved some credit. I had been through hell in a handbasket with no end in sight. A city kid like me trapped on a barren wasteland in the middle of bumblefuck. All this messed up crap being heaved my way every waking hour, and I had nothing on my mind in that one rapturous moment. Just as I was slipping into a dream, I heard a hoarse scream from above. The single scream grew into a choir of terrifying shouts and rage that littered the air as I quickly rose from my bed and stared up into the sky. Standing at the summit of the waterfall was a row of ape-like figures. Figures whose faces were cloaked by darkness, but whose bodies were straight up, frozen like statues as they raised torches above their heads. I stood trapped in a shocked sense of confusion as they grew in numbers. Behind the row of torched men was a mob of deafening maniacs. Screaming in a symphony of rage, in an effort to calm them, I raised my hands in the air as if I had a musket glaring at my face. It only infuriated them more as they hurled rocks from the peak. Rocks rained down from above, launching into the pool and ground around me. The once still water was distorted and bubbling from the influx of stones being heaved hundreds of feet from the sky. Suddenly, the brush on the far side of the lake shook, and the sounds of screeches came with it. With that thought, I bolted back towards the beach, hurtling over debris and into the wild. As I entered the brush, I faced a gauntlet of sharp thickets and fallen trees that were cloaked by the night sky. Absorbed back into the sphere of silence, sprinting barefoot through a forest that was composed of venomous frogs, monstrous spiderwebs, and poisonous fungi. Hardly an ideal situation. Every step I took, my feet was greeted by razor-edged rocks and sticks that kissed against my skin. The group of figures continued to yell and howl like a pack of rabid wolves as their sounds of anger rattled in my head. Behind me, rushing footsteps began closing in as what sounded like an army of people continued to inch closer. Above, the wide canopy trees blocked any aid of moonlight in my escape. As a result, my eyes were useless, and the pitch-black air shunned me from an exit route. I simply ran blindly, foolishly thinking I could pick up the remnants of the sound waves crashing from afar. Likely hallucinations that somehow kept me on course, swimming through the jungle's entrance with ease, every turn proving successful as I ventured deeper and deeper. I was left almost joyful, thinking I was approaching the beach's emerald shield and slipping away from the fingernails of death. Before my neck jerked back in horror, one of their claws ripped at my skin, pulling me back as they thumped onto the floor. More came with it, diving at me and pulling at the cloth of my shirt. Too consumed to succumb to their rage, I soldiered on, kicking up with my heels of my feet and punching at their hands and chins while they wailed in anger. Unable to calculate my movement, I darted through webs, doing my best to ignore the horrific inhabitants each contained. 8-legged demons covered my skull and shoulders, crawling from my head down to the bumps of my spine. Spider-infused silk rammed into my mouth as I broke through a final web, spitting white filth out from my tongue and slapping at both my back and head. Harsh jabs that propelled a fury of bites along my neck and chest. While I fought, over time, I was ineffective in my battle to ward off the arachnid army, and ripped my spider-infested shirt clean off, drawing the animal's footsteps while I yelled in despair. What was once a feverish tingling transformed into a wild sense of pain. The bites and beasts combining into the perfect death trap. Both nearly destroyed me until I finally leapt out the brush and into the shield snare. I wrangled through the entryway like a bat out of hell, clawing my way through the mud while the horde dove headfirst into the trench, one even impaling himself from the branches while the others gawked and hollered. Their cries and calls were deleted from my mind while I shuffled, laser-focused as I weaved through the tunnel. Mud caked my entire face, almost blurring my vision as I pulled myself towards the exit, bleary-eyed and drained as the gift of moonlight peered from the leaves. As I made my way through the final slab of brush, I noticed something odd. The beast no longer screamed, and the shield was no longer shook by the rattling and thrashing. They were motionless, now silent, while I writhed away from their onslaught. For the first time I turned around, flushed with havoc and terrified, but to my surprise, there was nothing left to see. The trees no longer rustled as the rush of footsteps were no longer chasing me. I stood there, with adrenaline pumping through my veins and fear consuming my being. I dumped my body in and out of the ocean, getting rid of the last settlers that were still strapped to my skin. I looked down at my feet and noticed how I was standing in a pool of my own blood, sticks engraved into the bottoms of my feet and splintering into my soles. They stuck out like needles smashed through wood, my coping mechanisms fading as the overwhelming pain took course. I stood there with my red sand-infected feet and thousands of fresh spider bites all over my upper body. Sapped from exhaustion, I then sat down, staring into the darkness. I was helpless prey, ready to be taken by the mob, ready to be killed. I waited for my inevitable death, but was left sitting in my own twisted nightmare. No way to wake up, no way to ease the pain, and no help in sight. My head became light and my vision once again blurred. I then passed out, face first into the sand, finally asleep.